I'm delighted to be here as a Colorado native. It's always nice to be home. So what I'd like to do is spend maybe 25 minutes or so laying out both some of the issues of the fissured workplace and what that means and what its impacts are in a variety of areas, including, of course, of particular pertinence to this group, its impact on worker health and safety. Talk some about not only the problem and its consequences, but something that I had the wonderful opportunity to address as the head of the Wage and Hour Division, what you do about it and how you think about the challenges of protecting working people in a substantially changed business environment. And recognizing the profound changes that I think in many ways occurred under the hood and in ways that made their impacts less, while the impacts people were aware of, their origin in business organization, I think people were less aware of, but are very important to understand in ultimately fashioning policies to address it. And that's certainly something we spent a lot of time in the Obama administration thinking about. I think there's a lot of wonderful work and thinking about this going on. I'll talk some about at the state and local level, certainly internationally, and also in terms of the work of different organizations, business organizations, worker advocacy organizations, other nonprofit organizations, and some professional associations who I think are trying to grapple with some of the implications of the fissured workplace. So let me talk about it, and I like to talk about it in the context of, I often start with the example of a hotel, because often, whether I'm speaking to an academic audience or a practitioner audience or a combination, usually I'm talking in a hotel. And I think the nature of the change is really illustrated by the fact that we walk into most hotels. Now, the Curtis Hotel isn't one we associate immediately with the brand, but most hotels in this country and around the world are denoted by some well-known brand. You know, it's a Marriott, it's a Hilton, it's something managed by one of those organizations. And so we walk into these enterprises and everything, you know, says the name of the brand. Often we've picked a hotel because of something we associate with the brand, and we might have an affinity program associated with it. We might just like the customer experience. And brands work very hard. That's a key part of their value, is making people aware of the brand and being willing to pay some premium for going to that brand. And hence, we walk into the branded organization and we immediately kind of assume, well, everyone there is working to the standards of that brand. It therefore leads us to believe everyone is an employee of that brand. But significant with the fissured workplace, in the hotel space, in this country now, in the branded area of the hotel industry, less than 5% of hotels that we associate with the brand are owned, managed, and operated by that brand. Just 5 or less percent. In the vast majority of the case, if you look under the hood, despite what you perceive as one company, is actually a range of companies. Some time ago, in the 1980s, ownership of hotel properties, the brands decided they didn't want to mess with that problem, and they went into a form of franchise structuring where they sold properties to investor groups. Initially, there was a lot of real estate investment trusts went into that space. Over time, private equity have now become major holders of a lot of commercial properties, hotel commercial properties. But whoever owned it, then another problem quickly arose, and that is many of these owners didn't want to manage, nor did they really know a lot about the hotel industry. And therefore, what they needed was a company to manage the properties according to brand standards. So brands remain important. You have, you know, folders, or I guess the equivalent digital storage space of this kind of information about how a Hilton-type company will be operated, you give that to the third-party management companies whose task is to make sure everything that happens complies with that, and that's important to the model. But then the third-party management companies, typically they didn't want to employ everyone, so they often, while they might have the general management staff, they went to staffing agencies, or they would franchise out the food services, or they would bring in other entities, subcontract maintenance. And so while you might not be able to fully see it, what I'm showing here is that although you have a hotel associated with the experience, what you have done is what I call fissured the employment relationship to multiple parties. You've broken it up in multiple ways. And that change has been profound. I use the term fissured. As a good academic, you always have to quote your sources. The source of the term came from my wife, who at an earlier point in her career, she's now an occupational health and safety specialist, actually, in the healthcare arena, but she was at the time a geologist. And one morning I was, as it's an occupational hazard of being married to an academic, you have to hear them go on and on about what they're working on at the breakfast table, and I was holding forth, and Miriam said, well, you know, what you're talking about is fissuring. It sounds like you're talking about a rock that's breaking apart. You know, and the analogy, you know, just I think is exactly right, because fissures do two things in a rock. You have a once solid relationship, the employment relationship, and as it fissured, two things happen. One is fissures tend to get deeper. And if you look at a lot of the structures in industries where fissuring has happened, subcontracting tends to beget more subcontracting, or as my example here, third-party management then requires someone to do the tasks, and so you break it further and it gets deeper. So you might have multiple tiers of fissured relationships, ultimately leading to the delivery and the employment relationship that a lot of us in this room spend our time worried about or thinking about. If you have multiple tiers, if you have deep fissures, from a business point of view, you have multiple levels where someone needs to be making a rate of return. And as you get deeper into those fissures, the economics of the industry, the drivers of the industry, the things that ultimately make people worry about and think about things like compliance with laws or whether to cut corners on health and safety become more intense. The second thing about fissures is fissures spread. So, and this also leads to the erosion and the end of solid objects and really the really transformation of employment relationships. This phenomenon has long been the case in certain sectors. A number of colleagues, friends from the past are here in the construction industry. Subcontracting has always been a part of the construction industry. Supply chains like garments have always had aspects of fissuring. What's remarkable about these changes is the fact that they have spread enormously across the economy. Initially very much focused on low-wage, low-skilled jobs, but increasingly they have moved upward, and it's not only jobs like janitorial jobs, the kind of housekeeping functions of hotels, distribution centers, a lot of the home care and health industry have now been affected by this, but it's even in things like law firms. Journalists, I've had when I was in Wage and Hour, I had lots and lots of talks with journalists, and I often found they got the concept immediately because it's what happened to their industry as well. So this is a pervasive problem. Its main elements are similar to what I outlined with hotels as well. There are three major things that lead to fissuring. Number one, you have industries that because of capital market pressures in particular have become more and more focused on a brand, on a core competency is what we would call it in the business school environment, on saying this is what is the value to consumers and to investors. The second piece is that you shed anything that is not related to that to other entities. Rather than being the party that does the employment, you make sure that someone else does that. This is something that was amped up after the Great Recession. And one of the things that's interesting that happened in the Great Recession, a lot of companies decided to get rid of part of their workforce, partly in response to the recession, partly in response to the core competency thing, but then they never took them back in. And they left it in this kind of fissured relationship. And the third element, and it's crucial and goes back to this kind of the thick book of standards, if you think about the first two elements, there's an inherent tension between them. If I am careful to protect my core competence, and that's what capital markets are expecting of me, and yet I shed the activities, I am at risk of those other parties undermining my core competence if I don't very carefully manage them. And so the third part of the fissured workplace, and this is really crucial in understanding responses to it, is you got to have a glue that keeps all these other entities operating consistent with what you're trying to do as the lead company. And that plays out in a lot of different ways. You got to understand an industry to understand how that plays out. In some industries like the hotel industry or in franchising in general, the franchise model is a method of control. On the other hand, if you look at how a lot of supply chains in the economy are organized, supply chains work because whether it's the retailer or the prime contractor or the prime driver of a supply chain, they have established fiercely clear and strongly enforced standards and monitoring behavior of how everyone in that system works. So you have to have the glue. One of the things, I'll talk about it in a bit when I talk about what we did and how we thought about it in the Obama administration, you got to understand the glue, because in the glue is really the place to ask the fundamental question: should you be allowed to have it both ways? On one hand, the lead company has these exacting standards to keep to the business model. And as a former business school professor and trained as an economist, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. And there's always in any economic system a desire to specialize and farm out some work because some other entity is going to be better at delivering it. That's gone on steroids in our economy and in business, I would argue now. But again, you can have that. The problem is that if you're going to make those parties work under very clear exacting standards driven by pricing models and other kinds of compensation models from the main company, should you be allowed to basically say, oh, but they're not our employees, they're not our problem, they're not our health and safety risk to manage, they're someone else's. That's the problem that I think from a fundamental public policy question we have to keep asking. We have to think about how well attuned our systems are to really say, should you be able to have it both ways? From a policy point of view, a normative point of view, I would argue, as you can already gather, the answer is no, you shouldn't be able to have it both ways. There is some system of responsibility we need to think about and make sure happens, even in a world where you're going to have fissured relationships in one form or another. One of the things that has been very rewarding to me to watch happen in the years since I wrote The Fissured Workplace and did some of the original research that led to that book is there have been a lot of interesting studies that have pushed that work in both documenting it and thinking about its implications. One of those was done by two colleagues of mine, fellow labor economists, Alan Kruger and Larry Katz, who tried to look at the change in these activities over several decades. The kinds of things I would call fissured relationships in Alan and Larry's work, they call alternative work arrangements. This is a depiction of the results of their study of the growth in the share of workers in the entire workforce in 4 different forms of fissured work: independent contracting, work provided by contract firms, on-call workers, and temporary help agency workers. You might have trouble seeing the figures. These are looking at 1995, 2005, and 2015. You can see an increase over that period of time, but really the striking change is between 2005 and 2015. And this is an estimate for the entire economy.
to me, the way to really capture how big those changes are. So still, the vast majority of employment is still in things we would consider more formal methods of traditional employment. But the growth has been, because we are a huge workforce, because we have 165 million people in our workforce, changes like this are big. The Katz and Kruger estimate is that somewhere on the order of 94% of net employment growth over the last decade, between 2005 and 2015, occurred in alternative work arrangements. So that one is to take home. 94% of net employment growth occurred in these kinds of fissured relationships over the last decade. Now that's net employment. That means there was growth, there was decline, but on net, most of it, the vast majority, happened in these kinds of relationships. So it has become, as I go back to my analogy, a pervasive part of the workforce. I want to briefly talk, and I certainly want to leave some time for questions and comments, about the implications. Why do we care about this? Why is it important to those of us concerned about any number of public policy outcomes related to the workplace? The first place I would focus on, and in fact my original research that led me to be very interested in this nature of business organization change, has to do with compliance with basic labor standards. And if you think what I said about deepening fissures, it very quickly sets up sort of the economics about why people don't comply. If you are working at a level several points down and you're receiving a price for your work, and that work requires a heavy labor content, it quickly can translate into an incentive to cut corners against competitors where you're all trying to offer some kind of service, to whether it's through a staffing agency setup or a subcontracting setup or even in certain kind of franchise structure setups, to go against what the law requires. These are from some survey work done in 3 major metropolitan areas. These are estimates of violation rates. Again, I'm sure it's hard to see where you're sitting, but we look at 3 of the most fundamental labor standards, or the researchers who did this work looked at off-the-clock work, which basically means not being paid for hours of work, which is, I found as the head of Wage and Hour, a jaw-droppingly common practice. Violations of our overtime laws and violations of the minimum wage law. And what these figures show in home health care, for instance, this research found that 88% of low-wage workers in California, Chicago, and New York had, in the prior 2-week period, had a violation of off-the-clock work. And you find comparably high, more than 3/4 in all the sectors, grocery stores, restaurants, and so on. Almost as high violation rates in the overtime space. Fewer violations in terms of minimum wages, but if you think about how low federal minimum wage is, even having violation rates like that in 2013, 2014, and again, I can attest as head of Wage and Hour up till very recently to 2016, even finding violations of a $7.25 minimum wage in many places is amazingly common. So the violation of labor standards is certainly one thing I would point to, and we could talk more about. The second, pertinent to the discussions that have been going on here yesterday and today and tomorrow, is health and safety. If you think about the implications of a fissured workplace on the coordination of work, and if you're in a hazardous industry, if you're in an industry where the intersection of multiple work crews or activities potentially exposes workers to either short-term safety risks or longer-term health exposures, very quickly you can see the problem created by having multiple hands with no one having direct responsibility for health and safety outcomes. I give you as an example of that something there was a lot of reporting about a few years ago, something that David Michaels, when he was head of OSHA, really took on because of concerns, and that is in the cell tower industry. How many of you have Apple iPhones? So now I'm going to make you feel even more guilty than you might have felt when, there was a lot about Foxconn and the way that Apple phones were produced. Well, there was a secondary effect of the boom when the iPhone became tremendously common. You had on the carrier system for the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world, they suddenly had this need to very quickly ramp up the scale of the carrier networks and had to expand very quickly. Well, in a traditional kind of telecommunications industry, those companies would have expanded with their own workforce. That was sort of the way we thought about this problem. That's not what happened in the mid-2000s. Onward in the industry and the creation of cell towers, either the expansion of cell towers or the servicing of existing cell towers, you went to something that was called the turfing system. And the turfing system was driven by a set of, this is the Fissured Workplace recipe, very strict, explicit standards put forward by companies like AT&T that were then farmed out to major players in different regional markets. I mean, really big players like Bechtel was one of the main turfers who would be paid a fee basically to manage and expand the network to AT&T and the other carriers' requirements. Very exacting standards, technical standards with very tight technical and timeline deadlines, and pay structures. Well, those big turfers seldom did the work themselves either. What they then did is they sold the contracts to local providers of those kinds of services to actually do the expansion and maintenance of the cell towers. And again, you had the deepening of fissuring in this case. My diagram here is part of a series of studies that originally ProPublica did of both the activity of the turfing system and then its consequences on health and safety. This was a multi-level situation in an AT&T work site where basically you had 3 players on a work site. One player was working at the top of a tower. You had a crew at the bottom of the tower working simultaneously but in an uncoordinated fashion. A pulley that was being used by the crew at the top broke, sending down a several-ton object that crashed down and killed the person at the bottom of the cell tower. Kind of a classic, clearly avoidable situation that was a product of the lack of coordination. And even if you look at some of the ways the turfing system sets up crews, it kind of pushes towards this kind of thing happening. You have an absence, and in fact an explicit absence, of the carrier taking responsibility for health and safety on a site at a point in time. And you have the kind of unclear relationship between multiple players. Now that's an anecdote. If you look at fatality rates over this period of ramp up, the fatality rates for cell tower workers were something like 10 times the level of construction fatality rates, which are some of the higher rates in the system. They were, to me, more striking is 3 times the fatality rate of underground coal mining. Cell tower work became one of the most dangerous occupations in our economy. The relationship of that and the growth of that and the rise of both absolute and fatal rates in cell towers was, I think, a sign of this kind of thing playing out. We could find similar things in the logistics industry. There's some striking and some very troubling reporting that was done again by ProPublica of the impact of temp agencies in different manufacturing settings. And also in the late 2000s, and then a similar kind of rise in injury and fatality exposures in the supply chains to automobile manufacturers that I know OSHA was very focused on. So This is a second aspect, particularly around health and safety, that I think brings this issue of work restructuring certainly central to the issues you're thinking about here. The final kind of, or related issue, health and safety is the ultimate risk shifting problem, but very much akin to that are other kinds of risks that the fissured workplace sets up. That with fissuring you get the danger of shifting the training function, which historically was something that lead employers would take a part of. If you have parceled out the responsibility for training, it becomes the incentives to provide that training lessen. Certainly the provision of things like pensions and healthcare systems get shifted, unfortunately, closer and closer to the worker in these kinds of systems. Unemployment worker compensation systems, one of the things that we frequently find and found in wage and hour associated with fissuring is something we call misclassification of workers. Workers who are clearly employees who are called independent contractors. When you go over that line, suddenly the independent contractor no longer is a part of unemployment insurance, no longer is a part of worker compensation systems, in terms of the law, is treated like an entrepreneur, even though with all respects, if you look at what they're doing, they're clearly still an employee. That shifting of risk of the social safety net is a consequence, therefore, of this. And then for those concerned, as we should be, about worker representation as embodied in something like, embodied in the National Labor Relations Act, which allows for, and the statute says, promotes collective bargaining. Fissuring really undermines the whole model we have had of organizing and representing workers through unions in this country. So there's a whole set of risks shifted there. The last major thing, and this is something I have, as I come back into my academic life, really want to focus on and bridge the gap, and there's a lot of really important research just over the last couple of years on this. Fissuring also has a profound impact on the larger problem of inequality in this country. I could show you a lot of different figures, and there's been a lot of good work on the growing gap in incomes in this economy over really from the period of the 1980s forward, a period that I would also say is associated with the growth of the fissured workplace. This is just one depiction, and if you can't see the labeling where you are, basically we're looking at income gains from the period of 1950 on the left side to 2015 on the right side. What you see is the red line is income growth in the 95th percentile, which kind of proceeded without change pretty steadily over that entire period. What you see flattening out is income growth at the median in the 20th percentile. The other figure you could overlay on this is the overall growth in our economy as measured by any number, whether we look at productivity, GDP per capita, other measures. That continued upward. So what we have seen increasingly in our economy is that the growth experienced by a growing economy over several decades has been shared by fewer and fewer people. I think one of the more striking ways this has been recently depicted by a sociology team at Stanford, Raj Chetty and colleagues, where they've looked at mobility. We all have this notion in America that our children will do better than we do, and that's one of our core aspirations, and certainly historically was backed up by the facts. A child born in a typical US household in 1940 had a 90% chance of doing better than their parents. What would you guess that percentage is now? What is the probability that some child born now will do better than their parents? 10-15%. Not quite that dismal, but it's a 50-50 shot now. And that's a huge change, though, to think about as basically a coin toss now that your children will do better than you. And I could tell you the probabilities, these are median probabilities. Obviously, if you're in the 95th percentile, your kid probably will do as well or better than you. If you are, as you go down the income deciles, the chances that your child will not do as well as you've managed to do increase. Now, I want to relate that there are a lot of factors, and I'm not saying this is all the fissured workplace, but recent scholarship and sort of the logic of the fissured workplace also, I would connect very much to this trend in the following way. Historically, sort of the emblematic example of this is something like a company like General Motors. General Motors used to employ people soup to nuts. And the reality was that whether you were working on the assembly line in General Motors, or you were an engineer, or you were doing white-collar work in a General Motors administrative activity, or you were doing janitorial or landscaping work, you were part of the General Motors family. And again, I could cite to you empirically, we found there were a lot, if you were part of a big firm, your wages tended to be carried up, whether or not there was a union present. That as a member of a pay system, employers tend to carry you upward with the wages of other players. And that is in part why we had for the post-war period a lot of upward movement. And in this figure, what I'm trying to depict is that sometimes we think rising inequality is simply because CEO pay has gone so high relative to the typical worker, and that is true. There has been an acceleration of the gap between median worker pay and the pay of top CEOs. But the real change of the fissured workplace is the fact as you have shifted work out from the mothership, as that person doing landscaping at the auto factory is no longer a General Motors employee, but several levels down, they are in a different entire wage determination and pay system. And that system has drifted down. So while it is true you have the Googles and the Apples and the Amazons of the world soaring upward, for people who are lucky to be in that bubble, their wages generally move up with it. But as those of you following a few years ago, there was this whole series of stories about, for instance, the drivers of buses to get Google employees to and from Silicon Valley. Those were not Google employees. Those were a contracted bus company. And the people working on those buses had abysmal conditions in terms of wage and hour and health and safety outcomes. And it's because they were contracted out. And so what you have now is a rushing apart of businesses leading to inequality, not just the growth in differences within businesses, it is growing inequality between businesses. And I would put that on the table as a third consequence that had an interesting discussion at lunch because health outcomes, as many in this room know from your own research and research of others in this community, health outcomes are related to income outcomes. This kind of consequence of the fissured workplace on income dynamics, at least in terms of research, I would certainly argue we have to think hard about their impact on health outcomes as well, for families particularly rushing down. I just noticed my time. I've gone a little long. Am I okay? All right. So let me talk a bit about so what? What do we do about this? Because I don't. My nature tends to be a half-full glass person on most days. Sometimes the news headlines make it every day looks like a half-empty glass. But I think there are ways we can think about this. There are certainly ways not only at the wage and hour division, but in the administration, in the labor department, we tried to change the way we thought about our work to deal with the fissured workplace. One is about the whole way you orient your thoughts about where should you be intervening. If we care about people and particularly in low-wage kinds of jobs, it's people at the bottom of employment structures that tend to be the ones who have the most adverse consequences. Historically, whether we are looking at how OSHA did inspections or wage and hour division did inspections or other state authorities did their inspections of work outcomes on any number of dimensions, well, it was natural to focus where the problems were. You put your inspectors at the level where the inspections, or where the problems or the non-compliance is happening. And if you look at enforcement kinds of strategies, they tend to be focused at the bottom of whatever the industry structure tends to be about. Well, clearly, that will lead to, yes, you're going to find problems down there, but if you ultimately care about changing systems so you get a different outcome, and you're not just chasing the effects, but you're actually changing the causes, you need to change regulatory approaches by, instead of looking at the bottom, you look towards the top. And we did a number of things at Wage and Hour that were all about thinking about things like joint employment, or thinking about ways of engaging people who were at the drivers of supply chains to say, look, maybe you're not, in some cases we're going to say, look, you are a joint employer by how our laws say it. Like it or not, that's the way you are. Let's get you to the table. Let's think about how you gain responsibility for things at the bottom. How you might change the way you vet subcontractors. Not necessarily saying let's roll back economic history, but saying if you want to use a subcontracting system, fine. You need to have skin in the game because you're determining so much there. We want you to vet those people differently, and maybe we could do that through joint employment. In other cases, OSHA has authority because of the way OSHA sets up its mandate on who is responsible for the health and safety in a work site. Sort of taking the model that has historically, although controversially, been applied to construction and applying it to other places that look a lot like, and a lot of places look more and more like construction. Bringing people to the table that way. We looked at not only joint employment through this kind of vantage point, but we also looked at cases where we knew the employer at the top would not constitute joint employers, but where they still had skin in the game. One of the agreements I was most proud of that I signed with the CEO of Subway Sandwiches was a franchise-wide commitment by that organization to work with the Wage and Hour division on compliance among their franchisees. Now that was a situation where we weren't seeking to establish them as joint employers, but we were seeking that they were at the table with us and took this on together. And we had a very successful relationship that in fact continues to this day. Those are the kinds of things that you get from changing the focus of your attention towards the top and towards the and looking at the bottom. The area of misclassification, I would argue to you, is another area just ripe with thinking differently about this problem. For people in this room, one of the biggest impacts of worker misclassification is its impact on worker compensation systems and the undermining of those systems because of the use of independent contracting. Well, we knew that our problem with misclassification at Wage and Hour was very linked to the problem that states had. Worker comp happens at the state level. And in the course of my time at Wage and Hour, we signed 36 agreements of memorandums of understanding of cooperation with worker comp, unemployment insurance, and payroll tax systems to work cooperatively to get traction on this issue. Knowing that we didn't have enough resources, they didn't have enough resources, but collectively we could work this problem together. Those are all blue on the map, but if you look closely, they are not all blue states. We had some of our most productive relationships, and some of the last MOUs I signed with states were with red states. One of our strongest partners was in the great state of Texas, working with the Texas Workforce Commission on misclassification. My point is there is a lot of commonality, common ground between different parties that are affected and have to deal with the impacts of the misclassification problem. And I could give you other examples where this can be worked. I think a prime area, we're in a period of time, obviously, where I would not expect the federal government to take a lead role, let us say, on the issue of the fissured workplace. But I do know that there's a lot of interesting work going on at the state and local level where people are starting to understand under the hood our economy is wired differently, and the implications of that for those of us who care about all kinds of different work outcomes need to attend to. And very interesting experiments going on in different states that I hope in this period of time will afford us insights into ways we can intervene more creatively in the future when maybe we have a different orientation at the federal level, recognizing the sources of some of these problems. I would always also, in closing, also point to the fact that I think there are really interesting opportunities for private organizations, for nonprofit organizations to take on the challenge of thinking about the fissured workplace. One of the most interesting relationships I know David Michaels would talk about if he was talking about his work on the fissured workplace was an alliance OSHA had with the American Staffing Association. American Staffing Association saw the impacts of a lot of their members who tended to be the larger, more responsible staffing associations that cared about training, were worried about some of the places workers were sent in that industry, were working on partnerships, and often in competition with the part of the staffing industry that tend not to be ASA members and tend to be responsible for really bad kinds of work situations and setups. That is the kind of association, professional associations, I think in the occupational health and safety area, it's a really important time to think about how different organizations in that space can just deal with the realities that our workplace is and will continue to be restructured in these ways. Think about how do we gain greater control again of the risks workers are facing, and then think about creative solutions to address the fissured workplace. So let me end with that, and I hope we have some time for some questions. Thank you.
So two questions. You know, in the construction industry, which is kind of the epitome of this, and the longest running fissured, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
industry, in 1980, 7% of workers were employed as independent contractors. Today, it's probably around 35%, and it's growing extraordinarily fast. And the question of who is responsible on our work sites has, of course, been litigated for 40 years now without resolution. But we have work sites where there are no employees at all anymore, only employers.
Right.
But it's not like they sort of crowdsource themselves together.
Right.
They come together and say, gee, let's try to build something here. There's somebody who has directed them to come and build. And so the question is, how do you overcome this relationship between being able to direct and not being held accountable?
Right.
And we have not resolved that yet to anyone's satisfaction in the US anyway. But in the UK, they've done a lot better job of this. And it was following the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster when 240 people were killed, and nobody could establish who was responsible.
Right, right.
That, in the UK, everybody agreed that this is not an acceptable situation, and we have to do something. And they came up with a concept of the duty holder. In any enterprise, there has to be somebody designated who is ultimately responsible. And that is a legal responsibility in the UK, so that when you start, for instance, a construction job, there is, as part of the founding documents for that particular project, somebody who is the duty holder, and that's who the health and safety executive will go after.
Right.
How do we get to that in the US?
Right. A great question. Let me take a couple of takes at that, because there's no simple answer to it. I think as you pointed to, the response to that tragedy was ultimately rethinking the structure of policy. And I think at some level, we need to get to that someday. We have to think differently about responsibility, whether it's in a supply chain system, a subcontracting system, a franchise system, in a way that, on one hand, something I heard a lot about when I was in Washington from employers, creates greater clarity, which I get. I think that's right. I think one of the problems of the current system and the fact we have common law definitions under some acts, and we have, under my act, we have one of the most expansive definitions of employment that I personally loved as the head of Wage and Hour, but it said to suffer or permit work is the definition of what constitutes employment under the Fair Labor Standards Act. You have to clarify responsibility in a way that I think our current laws do not do adequately in light of the changes we're talking about. How we get there, I mean, I'm not going to prognosticate on getting anything through Congress anymore, but I think that's one of the fundamental questions. And, you know, some states are already grappling with it. California's taken a stab at this and trying to create greater levels of explicit accountability of some party in the system so that it creates the right incentives. I mean, the nature of organizations, if you look at the organizational economics literature, you know, the idea of clarifying who is responsible and reducing the cost of transaction is what organizations, and I would also argue public policy, should be about. We don't do enough of that. We need to. In a shorter term perspective, you're right. We face this all the time. There was a case we dealt with early on in my tenure with a company called Paul Johnson Drywall. There were a few companies operating, and the basic story was these were huge drywall operators in Utah and Arizona, where the workforce that had worked for these companies for years went home on a Friday afternoon as employees and magically showed up the following Monday, and they had become independent LLCs magically through the creation of goodness knows what, and they became independent contractors. We went after that practice in that company with litigation originally with the state of Utah. This company did what companies often do, is they then jumped the border and went to Arizona. So then we worked with the state of Arizona, and we ultimately brought major action against these companies, a number of these companies, and required them as part of a compliance agreement to basically go back and acknowledge the fact these were employees. This is where I think in the shorter term, the need for greater cooperation about government entities, where you have just, I mean, unfortunately, it's not subtle. There are flagrant violations of who is legitimately an independent contractor going on out there that undermine all the legitimate employers who are acting responsibly and are doing the right thing. You know, this is why I think we got that kind of cooperation, because there are a lot of employers who aren't playing these games. I think in the short term, you certainly attack the flagrant egregious, but that is, as you suggest, a very, very tough problem.
So, as you know, this conference is about small enterprise, so I wanted to get to the relationship between fissuring and small business. And I think maybe one of the problems with the analogy of the fissured rock is you imagine a bunch of grains of sand.
Yeah.
That's not what we see going on. I saw one BLS report that said the percentage of workforce in small business has not really changed very much over the last decade or so. So I wonder if you could talk about how this relates in some way to fissuring and small business. Is this
right?
Is this a phenomenon that we need to be concerned about?
Well, I think, I mean, there are a number of ways we could go with that. I think one of the most profound ones is something, let me give you an analogy of small businesses in the agricultural space. One of the consequences of the fissured workplace is this impact on pricing. And that often at the bottom of these chains are businesses that tend to be smaller businesses, businesses that are scrambling, businesses with high failure rates, bankruptcy, going in and out of business. Often the less sophisticated business players who are just operating on the edge, and businesses that are being paid prices that probably are not sustainable if you actually follow the law. And so the problem is we have, and I think this is where very often small businesses have been mobilized against any form of regulatory intervention, in part because they often are in a game they can't win. That if you don't think about, again, the larger structure of relationships, it's going to inevitably set up these kinds of things that fall to non-compliance of smaller players operating at lower levels of the sector. So there is a part of this problem, and this goes back to the question Knut's asking, that unless you have policies and unless you have really incentives that change the rate of return, or essentially the pricing structure and the operational realities faced at the bottoms of fissured structures, which do indeed tend to be smaller enterprises, It's those enterprises that continually are the ones that are churning in and out. And you might recover some money for the workers, or maybe you improve some health and safety exposures in the short term, but you get the same kinds of things continuing to operate. We did pricing studies. One of the only places garment industry in this country is left in is in Southern California, where we have persistent non-compliance with the laws. We were so tired of finding the same problems in this even very shrunk industry, we went about a very different intervention, which was to try to build an economic model of the industry and connect compliance with pricing. And one of the things we found was that the typical subcontractor operating in that industry, and it's indicative, was being paid about 40% for the work, the piecework they were doing, that they would have needed, given the time studies we did, to comply with basic minimum wage and overtime laws in California. So the deck is stacked against it from the beginning. And so while those employers are violating the law, and you have to deal with that, the real problem comes from a consequence of a pricing system that ultimately results in these kinds of practices. So that's where I think the small business piece, it's a complex piece. It's a part where you need to make sure you're addressing both their need to, part of this is about education and all the kinds of things we normally talk about. But if you don't talk about the economic models that those enterprises are operating in, to me, it's very difficult to ultimately get any traction on changes.
Sorry, my voice is kind of soft. I'm following the first question, very similar to that regarding the policy. So as I know, OSHA has a policy for multi-employer responsibility to work on site as a subcontractor. So how do you address that? We were talking about we need some policy to address the subcontractor issue, but we already have that policy documented under OSHA.
Yeah.
So how do we connect to that? We have the small company, small enterprise company understood this policy exists.
Right.
And then how do we address and connect that to the education?
Right. No, that's a great question. And to me, the OSHA policy is an example of both the opportunity to change the way we regulate and the difficulties in doing that. That is, as you know, the multi-employer policy has been a very contested policy that has swung back and forth across different administrations for decades. I think when I look at that policy, it holds the seeds of really improving and addressing some of these changes. If you really do say, let's make sure that the party that has an impact potentially on affecting health and safety practices on the site really is required to take up that mantle. And not to, there are things that could happen way down in a construction site like any work site that could legitimately be the practices of an individual party. But there's a lot that happens on that work practice. And we all know, and there are people, again, first question, Knut Ringen has done wonderful work in the area of construction, really thinking about the management of projects in a comprehensive basis, that to me, the multi-employer policy could really be indicative of that kind of approach. I think sometimes what's so maddening to people is it's not like we don't know how to do some of this stuff. It's not like we don't, here's the basic problem. I would go back to my fissured model. Many companies are able, with exquisite precision, to make sure that the font size and the customer experience and the technical standards and the time tolerances and the technical tolerances of their supply chain or their subcontracting system or their franchise system operate with great success. And with my business school hat, I'm going to say more power to them. And with my public policy hat, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but WTF, you can't also manage health and safety and do all that stuff? That to me is the question we've got to grapple with much more explicitly. People, organizations know how to do this stuff. We just got to make sure that the alignment is more full-bodied.
We know there's a policy, and then we know people can do that. People are capable of doing that.
Yeah, well, it's the humans that, you know, I mean, I don't want to go political, but I think, look, elections matter. David Michaels, who headed OSHA, thought seriously about these problems. And, you know, I think we have to think about, ultimately, our laws are, as you say, are administered by people. And sometimes we're so caught up in just the people at the very top, we don't think about all the other effects of elections on how we carry out, how we do the nitty-gritty of our existing laws. But then more profoundly, I do think, as these comments suggest, there's some pretty fundamental policy questions we also have to deal with too. Because our laws are also, in my mind, out of alignment with a lot of the way the world works.
If we could take a last question.
Yes, Tony.
Thanks for your talk, David, and your work, and I agree with the focus on the top. I'm just, in an ideal world, what policies would you implement to protect the workers on the bottom? So, for instance, in Australia, casual or temporary workers have to be paid a premium, about 15%, to compensate for the lack of paid sick and vacation time. There is health care, mandatory retirement contributions, even for temporary workers, is 9%.
Right.
By employers. And so we have the relationship between casual work and mental health, so it's lesser in Australia. But there's other things, flexicurity, whatever. I mean, from your wish list, what would those policies be that you put in to help the workers involved?
I mean, I think there are, as Tony, your comment suggests, there are some base level things we just got to improve. I mean, obviously, we still have a problem that affects small businesses in where our healthcare system is. I think we made important, huge improvements in that with the ACA. We have further to go so that we carry more of these collective health costs on a national basis and have a system that really both creates coverage, but also deals with the costs of that coverage in a way that I think, as I say, the ACA gets us moving towards, but we're far from. And that affects the competitiveness of everyone in the system, as well as the exposure to health risks and healthy outcomes. You know, the minimum wage, you know, the president tried from his first day to the last day to try to raise, and the minimum wage is shameful. The best example of the fact that our minimum wage is out of whack is look at the number of states and localities whose minimum wage exceeds the federal minimum wage. I've talked with a lot of multi-state employers who say, why can't we just raise the minimum wage, get rid of this crazy quilt we have? You know, I think that's fundamentally important. But and then I think we've got to look at policies that really address, as I said, responsibility, that create clearer but very a level of understanding about responsibility in these systems that we don't have. I believe, and I haven't emphasized this enough today, there is a part of fissuring that is part of a dynamic economy changing. We haven't even talked about the gig economy, and you know that's another 2 hours. But there's part of that is about changing transaction costs in the economy, always reshuffle organizations. And as an economist, that's a good thing. The problem is where we haven't adjusted our social responsibilities with that. And that's where I think our public policies need to catch up. So 10 years from now, are we going to still have this kind of more broken kinds of relations? Are our children going to work more jobs than we did, and we work more jobs than our parents did? I think the answer is yes. But that then raises the stakes on us figuring out ways that we can provide protections, that we can make the parties invest in the ways we do, that we can provide people opportunities to get skills, to upgrade, to move in an economy that really is wired differently. Thank you all. Thank you.